Good morning, everyone. I'm Carlin Bowman, and I'm a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the first portion of the 2018 Election Watch season. This is the longest-running election analysis program in Washington. We'll be back on Thursday, November 8th, for a luncheon to discuss what happened on Election Day and what it means. Washington has changed a lot since Norm and I launched this program in 1982. What remains a constant, however, is the deep historical knowledge, the election experience, and expertise that this panel brings to these discussions. We're not in the prediction business, we're in the analysis business. Although we disagree among ourselves, we have always been serious and civil. Let me welcome my former AEI colleagues, John Fortier of the Bipartisan Policy Center and Henry Olson of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, my current AEI colleagues, Michael Barone and Norm Ornstein, and the newest member of the Election Watch team, AEI visiting fellow Sean Trendy of Real Clear Politics. Sean got his start as a research assistant at AEI in 1997, working for the late Alan Meltzer on his history of the Federal Reserve. He then left us for Duke University, where he got a law degree and a master's in public policy, and he's now finishing up a PhD in political science at Ohio State University. So we're just delighted to have him with us. Let me also say a word of thanks to Eleanor O'Neill, without whom we could not do this Election Watch program. She's been involved in virtually every aspect of the program. Let me tell you a little bit about how we're going to proceed today. I'm going to say a few words about the public mood, and then I'll ask Michael to discuss the Senate, John, the governor's races, and Sean, the House contest. Each of them will speak for 5 minutes. Let me quickly sketch the public mood. First, this morning in USA Today, President Trump has an op-ed in which he says, if the Democrats control Congress, quote, we will come dangerously close to socialism in America. Government-run health care is just the beginning. Well, we took a deep dive in the latest AEI political report to look at attitudes towards socialism and capitalism in the United States, and it's true that young people and Democrats are a little bit more enthusiastic than Republicans and older people, but you still feel in virtually all of the new polls, in a new Fox poll, in a new Gallup poll, in a new NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, people still have much more favorable attitudes about capitalism than they do about socialism. So that's just a quick take on one item in the news. Another item in the news, Nikki Haley's resignation yesterday. She is, if not one of the most popular people in the cabinet, perhaps the most popular. In the latest reading that we have on her, a Quinnipiac poll from April, 63% had a positive view of how she was handling her job as the UN ambassador. Let me talk a little more broadly now about the public mood. Voter enthusiasm. We've heard a great deal about this. Both the Gallup and the Pew recent polls reported that overall enthusiasm is at its highest level in decades. The gap between Democrats and Republicans started to close before Christine Blasey Ford's testimony. But a new CNN poll released yesterday showed that 62% of registered Democrats compared to 53% of registered Republicans were extremely or very enthusiastic. A Morning Consult Politico poll this morning shows the same thing. 77% of Democrats say they are very motivated to turn out and vote, compared to 68% of Republicans. In this poll, the Democrats had a 23-point lead on the generic ballot among likely voters. I have no reason to doubt these national polls, but they are national polls, and we're seeing something quite different in the hottest contest, with Republicans moving ahead, and that I think would also suggest that there is a great deal of enthusiasm among Republicans. Gallup reports, interestingly, on another question. Gallup asks and finds hardly any difference between Republicans and Democrats about their certainty to vote. We're seeing a big gender gap in some of these polls, but I think it's important to remember gender gap of 25 to 30 percentage points, differences in men and women and their levels of enthusiasm and their preferences in this election campaign. But I think it's important to remember that you need to understand the gender gap, but you also need to understand election intensity and turnout overall. For example, Ronald Reagan won his election with a 27 percentage point gender gap Bob Dole lost his election with a 27 percentage point gender gap. So it's directionality and intensity of interest in the campaigns overall. The top issues for voters in the polls are the familiar ones, the economy and health care. Every candidate in this election seems to have a health care story, and the issue has put Republicans in some places on the defensive. Democrats maintain their substantial advantage on handling it nationally. Republicans have the advantage on handling the economy. In the recent Fox and Quinnipiac polls, the GOP's advantage on the economy among their voters is equal to the Democratic Party's advantage among their voters on health care. Neither trade nor tax cuts rank at the top of the voters' list. The public is more positive about trade than in a very long time. This is a sentiment that usually accompanies a good economy. Republicans have a very slight advantage. Taxes aren't a top-tier issue either nationally. If Americans believed politicians' promises on taxes, the tax bill might have helped the GOP, but they haven't believed those promises for a long time. The GOP has a slight advantage on handling taxes. Nor does immigration rank in the top tier, an issue on which the Democrats have a solid advantage. But the GOP has the advantage on illegal immigration and border security. Voters nationally want both, a path to citizenship and border security. The Russia investigation ranks at the bottom of voters' concerns and produces one of the biggest gaps that we see between Democrats and Republicans. Only 18% of Republicans, but 79% of Democrats in the CNN poll said it would be important to their vote. In 2006, 2010, and 2014, pluralities said Presidents Bush and Obama wouldn't be a factor in their vote in the off-year election. In the newest polls, this one from Pew, 37% said that Trump wouldn't be a factor in their vote. But of the remainder, 37% said they considered their vote a vote against Trump, while 23% said it was a vote for him. Trump's approval is about where Obama's was in his first midterm. The Democrats lost 63 seats in Obama's first midterm. Last but not least, the Kavanaugh confirmation. Only Pew in its national poll asked people how important Supreme Court appointments would be to people's votes. It topped the list among registered voters in terms of being a very important issue, with more voters who planned to support the Democratic candidate saying it was very important to them, 81%, than registered voters who planned to support the GOP candidate, 72%. What did we learn from the hearings? Opposition to Kavanaugh's confirmation rose over the course of the hearings in most polls, but so did support, but by a lesser degree. In the final analysis in the new poll from CNN, 51% did not want the Senate to vote in favor of his nomination, while 41% said that they wanted the Senate to vote in favor of confirmation. In the new Morning Consult poll released this morning, 46% of voters said the Senate made the wrong decision in approving him, while 40% said it made the right decision overall. One thing that was interesting was to look at how the public evaluated the Senate's conduct over the course of the hearings. 69% in the Harvard-Harris poll called the hearings a disgrace, 72% of men and 65% of women. In the new CNN poll, equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats, 55 and 56% respectively, disapproved of the way the Senate handled the confirmation hearings. As someone who's read every poll on the confirmation battle, and I confess I've read some of them twice, I do not know at this point which party, if either one, will gain an advantage from the confirmation battle. I think we're going to have to see that on the ground. As I said, the new CNN and Morning Consult polls suggest the Democrats may have gotten a boost, but some very important key state polls suggest that the Republicans were helped in key Senate contests. Now we're going to turn to our initial presentations. They will be 5 minutes each, and I'm going to start with Michael Barone. Senator McConnell used a vivid simile in describing a handful of close Senate contests last week. He said they were like a knife fight in a phone booth. Michael, your thoughts?
Well, that's a little more genteel a characterization than I might perhaps go along with. You've got we've had commentary during the fight over the confirmation of Judge, now Justice, Brett Kavanaugh from people like an NBC correspondent who's called, says we've got to get rid of the U.S. Senate and the unequal representation of senators. It's unfair to the Democratic Party and so forth. The Democratic Party has managed to get along for 186 years with a Senate made up of 2 senators from each state, and the Constitution provides that no state can be deprived of its equal Senate representation without its consent. I think that that represents a certain degree of frustration on the Democrats' part that does not speak well of their political strategy. The Senate is currently 51-49 Republican. It also has a lineup of Senate seats that is unusually favorable to the party with the White House. Usually the party in the White House loses seats in both houses of Congress. It's not always true. Party in the White House gains Senate seats in 1962, 2002, but it does have problems with it. This is an unusually favorable alignment. 26 of the 35 Senate seats up are currently held by Democrats. 5 of them are in states which Donald Trump carried by double-digit margins. 5 are in states which he carried by single-digit margins. Only one of the Republican seats was carried by Hillary Clinton in the last election, the state of Nevada, by a couple of percent. And so the Republicans have a lot more targets than the Democrats do. The way I see it, it's the Democrats continue to challenge Republican seats in Arizona, which they lost by 3 points in the presidential race, and Nevada, which they carried by 2 points. You've also had this interesting Democratic challengers in Tennessee and Texas. From what I can see of those responses, they are falling a little bit short in terms of the polling. Beto O'Rourke is falling behind Ted Cruz in Texas, despite a lot of national publicity, and was resulted in a financial edge for the Democratic candidate in Texas. Pretty astonishing. But he's down 6 points in current polling. Phil Bredesen, former governor of Tennessee, former mayor of Nashville, moderate record, very successful governor by almost all estimates, is running behind Marsha Blackburn by about 3 points in Tennessee. Interestingly, he declared his support for the Kavanaugh nomination, which would have doubled the number of Democratic senators voting for it before it was decided by the Senate. And he's been running as a guy with a genuine bipartisan record. I think that the winds are moving against him. It's theoretically possible that Democrats could win those seats. I think you'd have to see some change in opinion. In terms of the Republican races, challenging Democrats, one of them they're challenging is Joe Manchin in West Virginia, the single Democrat who voted for the Kavanaugh nomination in a state carried by Donald Trump by 42 points in 2016. Manchin has continued to lead in polling for that race. He's a long-established figure in West Virginia, former governor. North Dakota, on the other hand, which Trump carried by 36 points, we've had, out of the limited polling, 2 results showing Democratic incumbent Heidi Heitkamp, a 1% winner in 2012, seems to be trailing by double digits, and I think the Republican candidate, Kevin Cramer, is the likeliest candidate to turn around the party holding any Senate seat right now. You've got 4 other races that I think are going to determine the character of the Senate. You have 3 states which Trump carried by 19 or 20 points, which are showing 1, 2, or 3 point races in average of recent polls. Montana, Senator John Tester, trying to win a 3rd term. Claire McCaskill in Missouri, trying to win a 3rd term, and Joe Donnelly of Indiana, trying to win a 3rd term. Such polling as indicates increased enthusiasm levels by Republican candidates, I think, is obviously of benefit to the Republican challengers in each of those races. And you're seeing the Democrats have current polling leads in 2 of them, and basically equal polls in the 3rd, Missouri. But they're also running below 50%, which is usually considered a danger point for challengers. In addition, we have Florida, the nation's 3rd largest state now, 1-point state in 2016 for Donald Trump, 1-point state in 2012 for Barack Obama. You've got 3-term Senator Bill Nelson, Democrat, and Governor Rick Scott of a Republican who's won. He's won 2 terms by about 1% of the vote. He spent $100 million of his own money in one of those races, $70 million in another. The fact that he spent large sums to win by 1 point brings to mind President John F. Kennedy's statement when he was asked about his father's the close right. He said his father said he was damned if he'd pay for a landslide. Those races, I think, are very hard to predict and can go either way. Just as an historic reminder, a small number of votes in Senate races can make a big difference. Back in the 1980 cycle, when I was working for the Democratic pollster Peter Hart, we sat down on the Thursday before the election and said, can Republicans win a majority in the Senate? Democrats then had a majority of 59-41 going into the 1980 election, a near supermajority of seats. Can Republicans win? We went down state by state, and we said, can George McGovern lose in South Dakota? And we said, well, yeah, it's possible he could lose, and so forth, and went down. And we got some number from 14 states that it was possible for the Democrat to lose, but we said, they don't ever all go one way, so the Republicans are going to fall short. Well, the Republicans won 12 of those 14 races. When you add up their margins of victory, popular votes, they amount to 1.4% of the total national electorate. 6 years later, the same seats, Republicans lost a net 8 Senate seats. If you look at the 7 close races, the popular vote margins accounted for 1.2% of the national popular vote. So a few votes can make a big difference, and I think that's where we're sitting right now.
Thank you very much, Michael. We're now going to turn to John to talk about the governor's races. The Republicans have what we call 26 trifectas in governor's races, meaning that they control both the governor's mansion and both state houses in those states. The Democrats have 8 trifectas. This is extremely consequential for redistricting. John, how do you see those governor's races?
Great. Thank you, Carlin, and glad to be back here at Election Watch. I will note that we should wish Election Watch a happy birthday. Now 36 years old enough to run for president, an older millennial, and also happy birthday to Norm Ornstein, who, had he thrown his hat in the ring in 2016, would have been the younger alternative to both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. So, governorships. Carlin mentioned that the so-called trifecta governors with legislatures, Republicans have a strong advantage on that today. But just overall, they control a very large number of governorships, nearly as many as they ever have. The numbers are 33 Republican, 16 Democratic, and 1 independent. 36 of those are up this year, and again, the Republicans have more of them, 16 Republicans, 9 Democrats, and 1 independent. And I think it provides a nice contrast when Michael talked about the Senate. There are also statewide races here, but you do not have the concentration of Democrats sitting in red states, and therefore the governor's races are likely to move in the broad direction of Democratic enthusiasm, and Republicans with so many seats are likely to lose quite a few. One point on that is that while in the Senate you have these 5 very strong red state senators that are represented by Democrats, you have only 4 governorships in the entire country that Democrats have won in states that Trump won, and only one of them's up this time, and it's Pennsylvania, and it's not very interesting. They're gonna keep that. So this is a place where the map is very, very good for Democrats. There are a lot of opportunities. So let me start with the small good news in the Republican direction. There is a state, I think, that Republicans will gain a seat, not from a Democrat, but from an independent. Alaska today with Bill Walker. Alaska has sometimes 3-party politics. There's an independent, a Democrat, and a Republican winning, and the Republican, Mike Dunleavy, is very likely to win. So the Republicans are likely to pick that up. And then I'm going to note the 3 dogs that are not likely to bark, and that is that Republicans have the governorship in Massachusetts, in Vermont, and in Maryland. They are states that Donald Trump lost by 25 percentage points to Hillary Clinton, and yet these governors are going to win by double digits very, very significantly. So that's probably the good news for Republicans. On the Democratic side, there are 3 states that we look to that are pretty strongly likely to go into the Democratic camp, and that is in Illinois, where all of them with governors who were relatively unpopular, all of them with governors who are leaving office, not Illinois, where Rauner is running, but Bruce Rauner in Illinois, an open seat in New Mexico after Susana Martinez is term limited, and Michigan, where Rick Snyder is term limited. Those are all places where Democrats are very likely to pick up governorships. And then I would focus on 8 other seats. There are 8 seats that are in the loose toss-up category. Some of them lean a little more Democratic, some of them a little more Republican, but I'll list them off, and I think these are the ones we're going to watch to see what the margins are for Democrats, whether they end up gaining just a handful of seats or whether their seats are up closer to 8, 9, or 10. And that is Nevada, Kansas, Iowa, Wisconsin, Ohio, Georgia, Florida, and Maine. If I had to break that down a little bit more, I guess I would look to states that are leaning a little more Democratic in that category, where I would say Nevada. Scott Walker in Wisconsin, while he has survived several scares in the past, I think is in some danger of losing this time. Maine, a couple interesting points about Maine. We have an open seat governor's race, and many of you may have read about the new voting system in Maine, or so-called ranked choice voting, where you rank the candidates in order, and it makes it harder for a third-party candidate to have a real effect on the race. It turns out that Maine is only partially moving in that direction on the federal races, on the House races that Sean will talk about, and the Senate races. It kicks in, but in the governor's races, it's still a straight-up regular vote. But here again, Republicans are in some trouble. Iowa, Kim Reynolds, the new governor of Iowa after the current governor became the ambassador to China. She is in some trouble, and Florida, I think, is the one people have watched a lot of. And I put that loosely in a leaning Democratic, slightly leaning Democratic category, because I think there's still a lot of chance for that race to change. But these are 2 relatively unknown candidates statewide. Andrew Gillum, who surprised in the primary race, where he won a race he wasn't expected to. He's an African-American progressive, has excitement from many in the Democratic Party behind him, but was not well known before. And Ron DeSantis, a Republican congressman, but representing a district in a state that is a very large delegation and is not as well known statewide. I would contrast that with the statewide race for governor, where for senator, where the candidates are very well known. Bill Nelson, a longtime incumbent, and Rick Scott, the current governor. So at this point, Gillum runs a little bit ahead of Bill Nelson. It looks like he has an opportunity to win that seat, but I think the candidates are very new and not likely to. Things could change. So I will move quickly on. Just there are 3 others that I will note and then end. I do think in Kansas, a tough race, a 3-way race also. Ohio and Georgia, while very close races, there's a sort of slight Republican lead in that case. So overall look is the Democrats are likely to pick up a significant number of governorships, 5, 6, 7 governorships, depending on how these 8 races go.
Thank you very much, John. Right on time. Now we're going to turn to Sean Trendy. Sean, you probably watch more congressional races than almost anyone in Washington. We've heard about a blue wave, a blue tsunami, a pink wave, a brown wave, and a red wave. Where do you come down?
I think probably the blue wave, but there's more uncertainty than I think you get from the generalized discussion. I do have to make a note on Scott Walker. When I mentioned to my boss that Walker was behind, his rejoinder was, yeah, Sean, but polls have shown Scott Walker behind for about 8 years running now. You got a point there. He always seems to pull it out, but I agree. I'm not sure that this time it happens. There's kind of two ways to do the House. You can either go through race by race, but I have 5 minutes and there's 435 of them, and it gets really boring. So instead, I want to kind of take a big picture look at the House and what drives it. The most important thing in driving House races is the president's job approval. And as Carlin alluded, in 2010, Barack Obama was at about 43% job approval, and the Democrats lost 63 seats. That seems like an inauspicious number for Republicans, given that that's where President Trump is right now. But you have to keep in mind that in 2006, President Bush was at 37% job approval, and the Republicans lost 30 seats. And that also included some freak circumstances, like Tom DeLay resigning, and then the Republicans realizing they couldn't replace him on the ballot, which was a problem. You had Don Sherwood, who had came out that he choked his mistress. That's a bad fact. And so it was probably more on the order of 25 seats. Regardless, there's a lot of variability in job approval. What really becomes important, and what the Democrats are up against this time, is a concept of exposure. And what I mean by that is that in 2010, Barack Obama's job approval was amplified by the fact that there were 40 Democrats running in districts that John McCain had won. Remember, John McCain lost the national vote by about 7.5 points. So if you were a Democrat running in a McCain district, you were facing a pretty Republican electorate. This year, there's about 20. It's hard to say because of redistricting, but there's about 25 Republican-held districts that were won by Hillary Clinton. And remember, she won as you've probably heard again and again and again, she won the popular vote by 2 points. So some of those districts actually have a little bit of a Democratic lean to them. Democrats need 24 seats to take control of the House when you bake in the seat they're going to lose in Southwest Pennsylvania. And so there's just enough Hillary districts to get them across the line. In other words, the president's job approval doesn't impact them as much this year as the Democrats' presidential job approval did in 2016. What this is ultimately a function of is two things. The first is the Democrats' clustering. The Democrats tend to live in if you look at Virginia, the Democrats tend to live in Charlottesville, in Northern Virginia, and then in Richmond and Newport News, whereas the Republican vote is more evenly spread, which makes it more difficult to draw Democratic districts. Of course, we can't just chalk it up to the Republicans' beneficence when they controlled redistricting. They did engage in some gerrymandering. And while that's been partly dismantled because of court decisions in Virginia, Florida, and Pennsylvania, it still presents a bit of a barrier to the Democrats. The bottom line is that Republicans are up by about 7.5 points on average in the generic ballot right now, which is the poll that asks nationally, who do you prefer to take control of Congress, Republicans or Democrats? Because of this clustering and gerrymandering, we don't know exactly what Democrats have to win the popular vote by, but it's not 50% plus 1. They probably have to win nationally by 4 or 5 points. And the generic ballot is inaccurate enough that Republicans are within shouting distance of only losing the popular vote by 4 to 5 points. In other words, the House is in play for Republicans, although Democrats are favored. On the race-by-race analysis, again, I won't bore you with the particulars, but Real Clear Politics has gone through. We estimate now that Democrats are at about 205 seats, Republicans at 198 with 32 toss-ups. If you allocate those toss-ups equally, and as Michael alluded, they do not always break evenly, and in fact, they kind of tend to herd one way or another. But just as kind of a rule of thumb, if you allocate them equally, it comes out to about 221 Democrats and 214 Republicans. If I go through and force pick where I think the races end up, it ends up more like 225, 226 Democrats for about a 30-seat gain. But again, there's enough of an error margin there that if I wake up the day after election and Republicans have held on to the House by 2 or 3 seats, I would be surprised but not shocked. So that's where the House stands as of right now.
Thanks very much, Sean. In a few minutes, I'm going to ask Norm and Henry to talk about what this might mean for governance and also for the parties going forward. But first, I'd like to hear whether there are any areas of agreement or disagreement with what's been said thus far about the races. Henry?
I really don't have any measures of disagreement. I would just, with respect to the House, the way I've been looking at it is to break House seats into 4 different types. The Republican seats that Clinton carried, the seats that flipped from Obama to Trump, the seats that Trump carried with less than 50%, and the Trump seats that Trump carried with between 50 and 53%. If you take a look at the 40 New York Times Siena polls, which is useful because it's one pollster, one methodology, cross-section of seats, almost all of the Democrat gains are going to come in the first 2. The idea that you were hearing earlier in the year that the special elections forecast a blue tsunami, for that to come true, you'd be seeing Democrats leading in a large number of seats in the other 2 categories. And the fact is, virtually every seat that the New York Times Siena polls have polled in those categories have the Republicans rather comfortably ahead, and also have Republicans beating Democrats on a question they asked, which party do you want to see control the House? So the data that we have suggests that Sean's pretty much on track, and you're going to look at a blue wave, but not a blue tsunami.
Norm?
So I would basically agree with that, but we do know waves are kind of funny, and they do tend to move in one direction. We are 27 days away. Stuff's going to happen, and that may impact the outcome of some of these races. My guess is that we're going to see a tilt a little bit more in a Democratic direction for the House. I would just mention one other thing, which is the hurricane in Florida, which could have a very substantial impact on a state, the governorship, the Senate race, and in other ways. We're not quite sure how. We do know that the last hurricane, President Trump, Florence, went to South Carolina and met with people who'd been devastated. They said it was, when they met with him, it was the worst thing that ever happened to them, and then they talked about the hurricane. But, you know, natural disasters, and here, with the hurricane bearing down on the Panhandle, which is a more Republican region, if that disrupts voting, it would tilt in one direction. Whether people see the response by the federal government and FEMA as being a positive one, it's just a cautionary note that things are going to happen here that may make elements like the Kavanaugh confirmation fade a little bit as other things emerge. But I would just add one other note, which is in the most recent poll, and we can't take any single poll terribly seriously, but the CNN poll showed this substantial enthusiasm gap between the parties, all done after the Kavanaugh confirmation. So some of the stories that suggested that this was going to activate Republican voters in a way they hadn't been before, so far may not have been borne out. But again, things are going to happen.
Sean or John or Michael, do you have any disagreements or agreements with what's been said? Michael?
Well, I just note that the last 27, 28 years since the election of Bill Clinton in 1992 and Newt Gingrich's Republican majority in 1994 demonstrated that Republicans didn't have a lock on the presidency and Democrats didn't have a lock on Congress. Since then, each president's party has lost control of the House of Representatives in the president's first off year, with the exception of 2002, when George W. Bush's job rating was very high in the 60-70% range in the wake of 9/11. So there's a sort of brooding discontent among American voters. You can see it in polling results that show the president's proposals for change. They say they want change, but they look at the president's proposals and they say they don't like that change. So we saw Obamacare getting negative ratings as long as President Obama was in office, and now that President Trump is in office, we find that repealing Obamacare gets negative ratings. We find that the president's tax cut, when it was proposed, got hugely negative ratings, somewhat changed once it went into effect, but that sort of thing. So I think that works against the president's party, but each of those 3 presidents has been reelected.
I'll
John?
just add one note on the House race. I broadly agree with Sean. I think the direction is in the Democratic direction. They're likely to win. The margin is a little unclear, but one thing to note is in some of the very large pickups that we've seen in the past, 1994 and then again 2010 for Republicans, they benefited from all these factors that Sean mentioned: the president not being popular, being the out party. But they also did benefit from the kind of realignment of American politics. We still had a lot of seats at that time who were Democrats sitting in very strongly Republican districts that would vote for Ronald Reagan or would vote for George W. Bush by large margins. And so that extra 10, 15 seats came about partly because there were some seats that needed to be dislodged. There are plenty of people who are sitting in districts that Republicans sitting in districts that Hillary Clinton won, but not by those overwhelming margins before. So I think that limits the upside. I still think there's plenty of upside for Democrats to do well, but the huge numbers we've seen of over 40, over 60, those are harder to get to because those seats don't exist anymore.
Sean, any disagreement?
Yeah, this isn't really a disagreement, I think, with what Norm was saying, because when I do the race by race, it skews more to the Democrats than if you just allocated the toss-ups evenly. So I agree. I think this thing probably breaks towards Democrats. This is more kind of what keeps me awake at night when I have to step out and make a prediction. Gaming this out is tough because there is not exactly a steady hand on the tiller at the head of the Republican Party, and that cuts both ways. I mean, he might do something radical that sends people screaming. He might do what he managed to do in the last few weeks of the presidential campaign, which no one thought he could, which was kind of be quiet. And that is part of why he won, is he didn't make waves in the last 3 weeks. Things that keep me awake. If you aren't voting Democrat at this point, if you aren't telling pollsters that you're going to vote for the Democrats, what is going to convince you to vote for Democrats? Will these undecideds really break against the Republicans? I don't know, because I kind of think that if you're horrified by Washington, you're already voting Democrat. These districts, and especially the Senate races, where the battle is being fought, skew red. So the undecided voters probably have an ancestral voting history to them. And of course, the elephant in the room, the 2016 polls, which were better than people thought. They get kind of a bad rap, but they were off in the upper Midwest. And they were off in 2014 in the upper Midwest, which is where a lot of these competitive races stand. So while I don't think there will be a national skew in how these races break, there very well might be a regional one. And this is close enough that any skew can be problematic.
Thanks, Sean. I have a few questions of my own, and I'm going to start with John. There are a number of these governor's races where there's significant independent candidates. You talked about Alaska. Are independents going to be a factor in a lot of these contests this fall?
Well, there's some individual races. One interesting one to watch is in Kansas, where the Republican Chris Kobach, conservative, former head of a Trump voting commission, is in a close race with Laura Kelly, the Democrat. The third candidate is somebody you might be familiar to, Greg Orman, who ran before as kind of a Democrat and an independent. And his numbers are okay, but it looks like what would happen to most third-party candidates, that those numbers tend to go down as people really consider a race. And I think he's less likely to be a spoiler than he has in the past. So, Maine is a place that has third-party people often. I'm not sure that that's going to be the deciding factor either. So there are some out there. The big one I mentioned is Alaska, where essentially the current governor was elected because he's an independent, and he aligned a little more with the Democrats, I would say. But you have a strong Democrat in the race, former Senator Mark Begich, and a Democrat and an independent, and so that leaves probably 50% or so for the Republican candidate. So that will have an effect there. But I guess I don't see this is a state-by-state phenomenon, and of course, if a race is very close, a Libertarian or other candidate might make the difference. But those are the races that I see it making a mild difference.
Quick question for Norm and Sean. As you look at this blue wave, will there be fewer moderates in both parties?
There's a very interesting piece by Elaine Kmark in the Times out today, where she did a really deep dive, not just a survey, but every candidate and their positions on issues. And what it suggests is that there's a sort of robust move towards what you could call progressivism among Democrats, but not a significant move sharply to the left. that it's more an establishment sort of outcome. There have been a couple of candidates, of course, who've gotten an enormous amount of attention. Ocasio-Cortez, for example. We've had two people on the left who beat establishment Democrats in Massachusetts as well as in New York, but both were pretty liberal people, so the voting records are probably not going to be much different. One interesting question, and you raised the op-ed in USA Today under Donald Trump's name. I'm not sure he wrote it. But the question is whether Medicare for all, which is probably not a practical policy, but which is not going to be unpopular. Medicare is extremely popular, can easily be framed and characterized as a government takeover of health care. And we're seeing a lot of Democrats running in competitive places, including in Senate races, who aren't terribly frightened by this. I think health care remains the sort of almost sleeper issue that may dominate in the end more in a lot of these races, as it did in places like the special election for Connor Lamb, than some of the other things that have been the hot button ones.
Yeah. Sean, moderates?
I mean, obviously, most of the Republicans who lose are going to be the more moderate Republicans because that's how these midterm elections go. The moderates tend to be in the more swingy districts, and so they're the ones that take it on the chin. The Democrats that replace them are a mixed bag. Some of them are the sorts of more conservative Democrats with military backgrounds, CIA backgrounds, so forth that you saw in 2006, but not all of them. I think you're going to see a more liberal Democratic Party. I don't think it's going to be a radical party. I don't think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is going to be more than a television presence. She gets one vote like everyone else. So it's kind of a mixed bag for the Democrats.
Can I just say, I do, compared to, look back in 2006, where the Democrats, of course, did very well, took over the House, and did so partly with a regular wave, but partly they recruited some very conservative candidates in some very red states that were able to win or some able to hold on to seats that have been there. I don't think we see that in this race. I do think we see some pretty moderate Democrats who can win in moderate seats, but we're not seeing as many. Connor Lamb was an exception, and then, of course, they redistricted his district. But there aren't so many Democrats who are likely to win in very, very red places, in the kind of purplish red places, but not the very red places.
Carlin, just, you mentioned the blue wall a little bit. The Midwest, of course, that was supposed to be the blue wall, crumbled in the 2016 presidential elections. This may be a time where it's a Democratic comeback, not building the wall necessarily for 2020, and building walls not a terribly popular thing anyhow. But in places like Minnesota, where some congressional races, maybe one that goes to the Republicans, but a couple of strongly Republican ones that are likely to go to the Democrats, these races for governor in places like Iowa and Wisconsin, House races in Pennsylvania, we're going to see a Democratic comeback. And then there's the South. And we'll be watching these governor's races in Georgia and Florida very carefully, because if Andrew Gillum and Stacey Abrams somehow win, you've got two African Americans, including an African American woman, governors in significant states in places where Democrats have struggled in the past, and they become instant national figures.
Thanks, Norm. Now we're going to turn for a slightly deeper dive to Henry and to Norm. Henry, we're going to ask you what this may mean for the parties, the results that we expect, and Norm, what it's going to mean for governance. 5 minutes each. Henry.
I think what we'll be seeing, let's take the consensus view here as a matter of fact. I think for the Republican Party, what will happen is a lot of traditionally Republican seats in high-income areas, which have a lot of their donor base, will have turned blue. And I think that's going to create a lot of intra-party stress, because you'll have a lot of people who will have lost their representative. And if you go down into the state level, you'll also see significant state legislative losses in these areas, because these Republicans who hold state legislatures seats will also be losing these Clinton-carried seats. And I expect what you'll find is a high-income revolt, that they will want a kinder, gentler president to win back their neighborhoods for what they consider to be their territory. And there'll be tension in the Republican Party over that, particularly since the president's national ambitions presumably move in the other direction, that for him. He's constantly been doubling down on the sort of change that his Obama-Trump voters in the upper Midwest like. Trade is a particular area of conflict between those two constituencies, and I would not expect the president to want to moderate in any way in order to accommodate the demands of the newly disenfranchised GOP donor base. So I would expect that if it's a narrow loss for the House, you will be seeing, particularly where you'll be seeing a lot of Republican inter-party battles intensify over the way in which Trump is a non-traditional Republican. With respect to the Democratic Party, I think the biggest challenge they're going to have, and this moves into kind of Norm's territory, is I look from the outside at a Democratic establishment that strikes me is still in denial about the strength and the energy of this resurgent progressive wing. I like Elaine, but I think she overstates her case. And you'll see that in part in the question over the impeachment proceedings that the base wants, but that the establishment thinks would be detrimental. And also questions like, would the House want to try and impeach Kavanaugh, even though they know that they won't get a conviction? There's such energy and such hatred towards Donald Trump that measures of prudence and counsels of prudence from the left, but establishment left, may not fly when those questions can't be papered over with let's simply battle against the president, when they actually have to make choices about how to go forward. That could very well be something that amplifies the looming split in the Democratic Party, which will come to fruition in 2020. So I expect the result of the midterms to increase rather than decrease the fissures in both parties.
Henry, a quick question. I remember the 2012 postmortem that the Republican Party did about demographic challenges facing the Republicans. Are those deepening on the Republican side?
The demographic challenge, I always disagreed with the autopsy for two reasons. One, its counsels would have split the party, and that the essential argument was let's throw the immigration restrictionists and the evangelicals under the bus, and that the measures that they proposed to pick up new voters would have been insufficient to pick up those voters. So you would have split a party and gained nothing. Other than that, it was a perfect analysis. But look, the Republican Party at some point in time has to win more non-white votes and has to deal with white voters who are increasingly not traditionally conservative on social issues. I think actually a saner version of Donald Trump would be a way to go, which is one that in his campaign tended to downplay social divisiveness and play up an active government role in the economy that differs from the Democrats, but that's what blue-collar voters, that's what Hispanics, that's what Asians, that's what millennials want to see from their government, is a limited but active government. So my view is that not this time, maybe not 2020, but at some point the Republican Party has to position itself to pick up a higher vote share among precisely the types of voters that the autopsy targeted, but move in a direction that is 180 degrees different than the autopsy recommended.
Norm, governance and the parties.
Sure. So just a comment on the parties. You know, we talk a lot about the ideological gulf between the parties, but I think there are other areas that are going to be a real challenge for unity in the country. Carlin mentioned the gender gap, which has been large for a long time, but it's growing some. We know that the marriage gap for a long time was a bigger issue than the gender gap. The difference now is that it's not only large, but the number of people who are not married is growing relative to those who are married. There's always been a religiousness gap. Democrats have done better among seculars, but now we see a population that is growing less religious and more secular. There's a growing education gap between the parties, and of course there's the racial gap. And all of those things, and then we also have an urban, suburban, rural gap. Those things have been there, they're being accentuated, and it's going to make it harder to find a way to cross some of these divides. On governance, let's start with just a word or two on the Senate. as we've seen, we have a tale of two elections here in many ways. The Senate contests do tilt more towards the Republicans. Question is whether a wave overcomes that. And then it becomes a question of whether, not just if Democrats can somehow win a one-seat majority in the Senate, which means they have all the chairmanships. It would put a stop to all the judges moving forward. It would create a very different dynamic for presidential executive nominations and appointments. And then it's on the other side if Republicans just hold on with a one-seat or two-seat or manage to increase their margin. Increasing the margin would give them much more ability to move confirmations through. We would see dramatic changes in the makeup of the judiciary, certainly. In the House, if there's a Democratic majority, the first thing to keep in mind is there's going to be a significant leadership challenge. We know that far more Democratic candidates running, who are the ones in seats that they're likely to win, have said they're not going to vote for Nancy Pelosi as Speaker. But what happens if a large number of them don't, and if you get a significant majority of Democrats in their caucus nominating Pelosi for Speaker, we could have a very interesting beginning of the new Congress. At the same time, whatever happens with leadership, and it's up and down the line, the top three Democratic leaders are all in their late 70s or early 80s. What happens, whether there's an infusion of young people in the leadership, and whether there are people who are capable of moving into the leadership with a significant increase in the number of more moderate candidates, along with some of those who are more at the left end of the scale, can find a way to unify the caucus. But keep in mind that we're not talking about legislation moving through. Under any of these circumstances, we're not going to see a significant amount of legislation moving through. It's all going to be about oversight and investigations. And here I would mention three names to keep in mind who are among the most capable Democrats in Congress. Elijah Cummings, who in a Democratic majority will chair the Oversight Committee, Jerry Nadler, who will chair the Judiciary Committee, and Adam Schiff, who would chair the Intelligence Committee. Dramatic changes from what we've had under Republicans. My guess is Democrats will staff up dramatically themselves. We will probably also see an increase in staff and maybe even a return to the Office of Technology Assessment, bringing scientific expertise back into Congress. But we're going to see an awful lot of investigations. My guess is the FBI is going to be a little bit nervous now, both an investigation in which we would see subpoenas of emails, texts, and others between the FBI and the White House over the investigation that went on into Brett Kavanaugh. Also now with questions about the FBI having gotten information from the Saudis that they were going to take Mr. Khashoggi, and apparently that warning was not given to him, which is itself a violation of the law, along with questions of whether you do get any kind of impeachment investigation into the president. And there'll be some, I think, pretty recklessly at this point, calling for impeachment of Kavanaugh. Those things are not likely to happen, but you're going to see a Judiciary Committee that will exercise its muscle and will create all kinds of headaches for the administration, and that includes questions of corruption, emoluments, and other areas. And Adam Schiff is likely to take a very different tack with the Intelligence Committee than we've seen with Devin Nunes, for example. All of this means both headaches for the president and a much more contentious Congress as we move ahead. But we're going to see real challenges as to whether we can do even basics in governance. I'd mention one other point, which is one thing that we expected might happen in a bipartisan basis is a big infrastructure bill. It was never made a priority by the Republicans in Congress or pushed by the president. You could imagine a President Trump now turning around and saying to Democrats, all right, let's do a big infrastructure bill. It's in everybody's interest in a way, but it would go against the political interests of doing something that might benefit the president and the economy as you move towards the 2020 cycle. And so we're going to have some interesting challenges on that front. And one final point about this election, Paul Ryan said we might see a partial shutdown before the election over the building of the wall. Who knows what impact that would have on the election, but the fact that it's even being raised is an interesting question of which party benefits at this point from a shutdown or a focus on building the wall on the Mexican border.
Yeah. John, Michael, Sean, any thoughts about governance or the parties?
I just wanted to weigh in. I think Norm's absolutely right about the changes in congressional leadership. It's obvious at the Democratic level in the House that there's possibility for some significant change. I think people mostly think the Senate will be pretty boring, that you'll have Chuck Schumer will stay as leader. And I mean, Mitch McConnell has, if he wasn't already pretty secure, cemented his place as the leader on the Republican side. I will note, though, that there is below Mitch McConnell and somebody who might be looking to be a down the road successor to him. There's a lot of change because of term limits, and so you have John Cornyn, who will essentially be out of his job, and then people like John Thune and others looking to move up, and so that may be a longer term play. But Republicans will be looking for who might be a successor to McConnell, whenever that is.
Michael?
I would just footnote Henry's comments about minority groups. I think there's already shifting going on there toward the Republicans. If you look at the New York Times upshot polls at the Hispanics in those polls, we're not seeing, the kind of 8-1 Democratic margins that the Democrats have been licking their chops over for some decades. They're not voting like blacks. They're voting, or have been voting. They're voting more of a mixed breed, as the left-wing professor Richard Alba suggested. Their racial consciousness is perhaps not so high, their consciousness as minorities, because they're not being treated the way black people were treated in America in the 1920s or 1950s and so forth. There's just a really big difference. And so I think some of that's already happening, where you see Donald Trump repelling people. It's more towards the upper income scale, as you mentioned. The high education, high income people. You have Hillary Clinton bragging about how rich her constituencies and her voters were. That's not something that I grew up hearing Democrats brag about, or Republicans. They try to keep, the word Republicans in Michigan was that they didn't allow people with Cadillacs to put Republican bumper stickers on, because that indicated the rich
Sean,
people
do you have
didn't want to
thoughts on
show that up. So, one of the Democratic claims now is we want to get rid of that bill limiting the deductibility of state and local income and other taxes on your bills. That's a big Democratic demand. Doesn't have any impact on anybody with an income under $350,000.
Yeah. Sean, any thoughts on what's been said?
Just briefly on the parties, because no matter what happens after the election, there'll be recriminations and autopsies. The notion of the Republican Party throwing white evangelicals under the bus, which you see coming from kind of GOP elite circles semi-annually, is terrible from a winning perspective. I have libertarian inclinations, so on a political level, I'm kind of like, okay. But the Republicans in 2016 got more votes from white evangelicals than Democrats got from all non-whites combined. You're asking the Republican Party to do the equivalent, or you're advising the Republican Party to do the equivalent of telling the Democrats to campaign on jettisoning the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Like, the damage it would do to the Democratic coalition to do that is what the damage of jettisoning white evangelicals would do to Republicans. The other thing is that if we were doing, this is my old riff, if we were doing this in 1924, I would tell you there were three things about politics you could take to the bank: that African Americans would always vote Republican, that the South would always vote Democrat, and that the white working class was drifting towards Republicans, and so Democrats were shut out. And after Republicans won the popular vote by 20 points in 3 straight elections, that would look okay. Within 30 years, all those predictions would be not just wrong, but terribly wrong. So in the long term, politics is extremely difficult to predict. I do think parties should be more focused on the short and medium term.
Well, I would just add that I'm working on a book of essays about how the parties have adapted. And we have parties that are 186 and 164 years old. They have adapted over time. Sometimes it takes a little while to kick the donkey hard enough or the elephant hard enough for it to mend its ways and be able to win elections again, but they always have done so.
Now it's time for your questions. We'll have microphones, and we'd like you to identify yourselves. Who has the first question? Right here. And if you could identify yourself.
Hi, I'm David Imens from AEI. Going off of what Henry noted about the need for Republican candidates to kind of synthesize conservatism and populism and create a kindler, gentler Trumpism or Trumpism with a human face, what Republican candidates have you seen so far doing that in this election cycle? Of
None.
both? None?
None. That was easy. Next question. Right back here. You could say more about that if you want, Henry.
No, it's just the Republican Party remains unwilling to deal with simple facts. It remains a party that wants to believe that the old coalition was a winning coalition, that Donald Trump was an aberration, and the number of people, there are very few people who are willing to start talking in a new way. The lesson they seem to have taken from the Donald Trump election is to talk more about opposing immigration, but nothing else. And I think that's a very short-sighted view. I think to the extent Trump's appeal was based in something that could be translated into policy, it was much deeper than that.
Question in the middle. Yes.
Hi, David Krukoff, Douglas County, Maryland, the future of the District of Columbia. There's an old adage, it's the economy, stupid. Has that adage become stupid? And does it apply only to presidential elections and not to midterms?
Well, I would say that it doesn't apply as much as it used to. Political scientists like to make generalizations. That voters will always care about the economy, or voters will always do this and that. Voters are a product of their times, of what they've experienced, of what they've learned over the years. Voters who had living memories of the Great Depression of the 1930s and of World War II reacted very strongly to give landslide re-elections to presidents who were perceived to have produced peace and prosperity. Eisenhower in '56, Johnson in '64, Nixon in '72, and Reagan in '84. That doesn't happen anymore. If it did, Donald Trump can say that the economic statistics that have been produced are very favorable in a variety of ways. Not all, but there's certainly some very good talking points there. He promised to help raise wages for low-income, lower-skilled people. That's actually happened. Whether or not his policies have produced that, you can argue, but it's happened. He doesn't seem to be getting very much of a premium for it. It's overshadowed by his, the strong cultural feelings of on the positive side and even more on the negative side that he inspires. So I would say that, what percentage of voters today have living memories of the Great Depression? Well, it's, yeah. I beg your pardon, Norm. I have the Great Depression of 1873 in mind. But in any case, the answer is it's not as important as it used to be.
Question back here.
Hi, my name is Lita Iden. I'm from Clarksville, Maryland. And I would like to know, what does either party, Republican or Democrat, plan to do to keep America at the forefront of the scientific development?
Government. Has government been the main producer of scientific progress throughout our history? It has at some point, certainly, atomic energy, the Manhattan Project of World War II, when government devoted 1% of GDP to the Manhattan Project. Government was a part of it. My observation is that, the defense and military produced, inspired a lot of our technological innovation and development in World War II and for some decades afterwards, and less of it to the present day.
So I would say, I mentioned earlier that I think Democrats, if they take the House, are very likely to bring back the Office of Technology Assessment, which was eliminated by Newt Gingrich when he became Speaker. And it was really the first step in moving away from scientific expertise as a core part of the debate over policy. And obviously that's become much more controversial with environmental issues and others. I would also expect that if there's a Democratic House, they're going to pass appropriations bills that will sharply increase funding for the National Science Foundation. They will, by the way, put some serious constraints on what's being done with the census. They will add significant funding for the National Institutes of Health, and we're going to get some interesting back and forth and disputes over that between the parties.
Questions on this side of the room? Right back here? Or right, I'm sorry, right back there, yeah.
Hi, Brendan Campbell, Arizona PBS. I'd like to actually talk about Arizona, if you would talk about that a little bit. This tight Senate race we have, what that might portend moving forward. We have a couple tight congressional districts, too. We've gotten to the Midwest a little bit, but it's sort of a purple state in the Southwest.
Henry, I know you have some thoughts about the Senate contest there.
Arizona's going to be very tight. It's got many fewer of the white working class voters who moved over to President Trump, many more of the Mexican descended Latinos who turned out to oppose him, and high income whites who crossed over. I think if I had to guess, I'd say Sinema is likelier to win by a point or two because of those trends. But it could easily be the other direction. I think virtually everyone says that Arizona 2, the Tucson seat's going to switch. You'd have to get into a pretty big tsunami for another House seat to switch. There's not a serious challenge in Arizona 1, which is a Trump-Romney district, but Wendy Rogers is a weak candidate. And the other House seat in Arizona that could possibly flip would be Dave Schweikert's seat, but you'd have to get a much stronger Democratic advantage for that to happen. And I think that's pretty much where Arizona stands right now.
Sean, do you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I think I don't know that I'd agree that Arizona is a purple state. I mean, it is still the same state that Mitt Romney and John McCain carried pretty handily while losing, 6-point Republican lead. I'm not convinced that what we saw in 2016 is the rule yet, although 2018 might alter that perception on my part. It's one of those states where I don't know how the undecideds are going to break. You could make a case to me that the undecideds are traditional Republican voters who don't like Trump, and they're going to ultimately vote for a more moderate Republican like McSally. But I don't know. I think it is a pure toss-up.
In the back.
Hi, my name's Michael Heseltine. I'm with American University. I wanted to ask you about the idea of 2018 being the year of women. We have a kind of record number of women running for office. We'll have a record number of women in the House, for example. And how does this kind of affect the output from Congress, how people see Congress, and also how people see the parties and this increasing divide between the two parties?
Well, I can see by your accent that you may be from a country that has no experience with women in high executive positions, except maybe over the last 40 years. I think it's become less remarkable. I mean, we have people, well, this is the first woman of Serbian descent that has won in a formerly, something or other district. I think it's interesting that women candidates from minority backgrounds that used to be considered a disadvantage seem to be considered by voters as just other candidates. I mean, sometimes you'll find a woman candidate that blames, white women are influenced by their husbands ordering them to vote against Hillary Clinton, and that's why she lost. I think that's it's unfortunate that anyone lets themselves believe that.
Let me just add, so anytime there's a Democratic wave, it's likely to be better for women. More women are Democrats, more women are Democratic candidates. But I will note this: the candidate pool this time is really extraordinary. More on the Democratic side, a little bit on the Republican side, but certainly strongly on the Democratic side. And that is the number of Democrats who've won House primaries, the governors, which I talked about. A very significant number of those candidates running for governor are women as well. So it is a general trend. Number of women are going up. Democrats winning usually accelerates that trend. But the candidate pool is just extraordinary number of women have been elected in their primaries to represent the Democratic Party.
And it's, we talked about the gender gap in the public as a whole. We're seeing a very substantial and growing gender gap in candidates and the likely ones to be elected. Just an extraordinary number of Democrats, women who are going to be there, and if there's any success in the Senate, there'll be a couple of more Democratic women there as well. And there are just fewer Republican candidates who are women who are running, and some of those who've been in the House who are leaving to run for the Senate or for other reasons are not going to be replaced by other women as well. So we're going to see very different pictures when you get the class photos taken of the parties in the House and the Senate.
Yeah.
One thing I just want to add is that I think part of what you're seeing is a reflection of the makeup of the Democratic Party, that exit polls and other polls show that around 62% of Democratic primary voters are women. We know that the sort of woman who chooses to be a Democratic primary Democratic voter is highly likely to prize their political identity as tied up with their gender. And I think you're beginning to, you saw it somewhat with Hillary Clinton. I think you're going to see it again in 2020, that the supermajority of Democratic voters are women, and they want to, by and large, elect a woman. And it would not surprise me to see a female nominee emerge in both wings of the Democratic Party, so that you would have two women fighting it out for the Democratic nomination rather than see a man step in.
Yeah,
How about Nikki Haley?
Sorry.
There are also
What?
these
Well,
Democratic...
I don't think she can win the Democratic primary.
Also, these women veterans, keep your eye on people like Amy McGrath, fighter pilot running in Kentucky. If she wins, women who have been in the military are going to be very significant figures in our politics, and it's something we have not seen before.
Exactly. We have time for one more question in the back.
Oh, thank you. Leon Peace. My question is, last month the Brookings Institution came out with a report talking about the unexpected potential political power of black women in the electorate. What impact do you think that might have on, say, races in states like, say, North Carolina or Ohio as being an overlooked political force?
Well, you do have Stacey Abrams, who's a very strong candidate for governor, the Democratic nominee in Georgia, which is the 8th largest state. That's certainly an interesting phenomenon, as others have mentioned here on the stage. You can find, black women taken as a group are probably the strongest segment, pro-democratic segment that you can find of the electorate, any way you slice it or dice it. But you're looking at 6% of the total electorate. That's significant in any election.
I think the most interesting thing that's developing, when I started following elections, basically African-American representatives came from African-American minority districts. I don't even know that there were exceptions except a few Republicans here and there. What we're seeing this cycle is that people of color and women of color in particular are emerging in districts that are swing districts that are overwhelmingly white. Obviously, you have, for the example of Keith Ellison, who is moving on, but was elected in Minneapolis, of all places. The representative from Delaware is African American, which again is an overwhelmingly white jurisdiction.
Well, we have Barack Obama.
And
who
Barack
is not
Obama, yeah.
But
it's
a considerable figure in American
it's
politics.
It's significant that race is becoming less of an issue in what white people are going to consider for representation, and being more generally defined as just another part of partisanship.
On that note, I want to thank the panel and thank all of you for coming, and we hope to see you on November 8th. Thank you.